Good afternoon, Michael Malice here. Let that be your welcome for the next hour. I got to tell you, I'm kind of nervous about our next guest because he's such a big shot and he has so much better things to do than this podcast. But I am thrilled and honored to have Marc Andreessen here on the show. Marc is one of the most influential VCs on earth. Your resume is insane. You were involved with Mosaic, which is the first web browser. Netscape, which I used when I was a college student in the late 80s. Your firm has invested in things like Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Pinterest. I mean, the list goes on and on. You have had a major impact on our culture and the world. Do you ever, this is kind of a softball question, but I really want to ask, do you ever just sit back and look around at like the internet and be like, holy crap, like my fingerprints are all over this thing?
Well, the most amazing thing is it worked. Like it actually all worked. Like it actually all happened. I mean, I don't know if you remember, if you're quite old enough to remember, but like this was not obvious in the beginning. Like all the smart people, all the experts, all the big company executives, all the talking heads, they all said, yeah, this is not something normal people are going to do. This is not a technology. First of all, we'll never be able to get it to work. That was the first thing. And then people just won't want it. Like they won't want it. And it turns out they do.
A few other questions. Of all the guests I've had, when I've told people that I'm having you on the show, their reaction has been like, oh my God. You would think on paper, I'm having a VC on the show. People like, snoozers. Why do you think I know this is kind of like a weird question to answer about yourself. Why do you think you have such a reputation among people who are technophiles and fans of culture in general?
I mean, so I was raised in the American Midwest. And so I've now become incredibly uncomfortable. I now feel like a witness in the Amber Heard trial. Not quite sure what to say. So I think the big thing, I mean, look, I don't think I can answer the question. I guess I just say, look, I have now been lucky enough in my career, like I've been at the very least present, if not a part of, a lot of the big shifts in technology over coming up in 30 years. Part of it I think is just getting older. And then everything keeps changing, right? This is the other thing that I really love about what we do and about our industry is like everything keeps changing. Like people keep expecting all of this stuff to just, stabilize and normalize. Yeah. And it's at some point, like, it's like people always compare, it's like, well, the internet's like electricity, right? Like at some point it's just going to fade into the background and you're just going to use it, but nobody's going to talk about it anymore. And that never quite seems to happen, right? And so the internet keeps changing, software keeps changing, technology keeps changing. And of course, the impact, we have a long discussion about the puts and takes in this, but like the impact that this technology is having on our world, just is just expanding. Things are just getting more dramatic. And so it at least from my standpoint, it still feels like we're at the beginning of a lot of this. And I think maybe other people have that feeling also.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because it does seem that, like if you look at like corporate media, like news channels, right? Like, it's going to be on certain channels. It's going to be very similar to what is 10 years ago. These people are shaking their fists at this group. These people are shaking fists at this group. But with the internet, there really is this sense of dynamism. And I was just at a wedding last week, and a prominent author I was there with was telling his agent that like, oh, there's too many podcasts out there. There's no space for another podcast. And I thought it was just so ridiculous, because the internet, there's always room for that next YouTuber, the next Twitter, or the next so on and so forth. Let me ask this. I used to do co-authoring books for celebrities, and my editor gave me some of the best advice I ever had. He said, when you're looking at books like this, the goal is to get the reader to understand what it's like to be the protagonist. So let me ask you a few questions in that vein. Is your life basically like Shark Tank? Are people constantly trying to pitch stupid ideas to you and you have to smile and nod?
No, so I would say it's the opposite. I have actually mixed feelings about Shark Tank, because I think it's great to have it's great to kind of promote the idea of entrepreneurship, and it's great to kind of see people doing that. And I think it has caused a lot of people to think about being entrepreneurs who wouldn't have done that otherwise. But no, the dynamic is not like that. I'd say that there's a bunch of things that are different. So one is we don't tend to get the raw pitch. It tends to be building relationships with people over long periods of time. Like usually by the time we work with somebody, usually it's somebody we've known for years, or we've known a lot of people who have known them for years. And so we have some reason a deep reason to believe that they're really good at what they do. And then the other thing that I've learned over time the hard way is, like, at least in our industry, like there really aren't any bad ideas. like there are a lot of early ideas. There are a lot of ideas where it's going to be like, yeah, they're going to pitch you the idea today. It's going to happen 10 or 20 or 30 years from now. And for that entrepreneur, that's the same thing as being wrong, right? Because their company's not going to make it. That if it takes 10 or 20 or 30 years for something to happen, like that startup is not going to make it. It's going to be some other company in the future that does it. But at least my experience is basically, if you're talking to the smart people in the fields, they're basically right all the time. They're right about the things that will ultimately happen. And I would even go so far as to argue, like, I think a big part of that is, I think a lot of it is, I think the ideas are just kind of obviously good ideas, right? They're just like, it's obviously a good idea for people to be able to communicate on, communicate it. So it's obviously a good idea for people to be able to broadcast, do podcast, like these. People come up with reasons to argue against it. It's obvious that there should be a form of digital money, right? That's just like, that's just like an obvious thing. And in fact, people have been talking about digital money for 30, 40 years. It's one of these things that has this incredibly elaborate backstory. It kind of took Bitcoin. It took a technological breakthrough on Bitcoin to have that happen, but that idea was not new, nor was it crazy. And so the way we generally think about it is, we're trying to zero in on kind of the most competent people in the world at being able to build these kinds of things. And then we're trying to be actually very open-minded. We actually want our people to kind of be increasingly open-minded as they get older, in terms of the ideas they're being presented with are all probably good ideas.
One of the big misconceptions I had when I graduated college, which was as a result of reading The Fountainhead, was the idea that if you're young and driven and talented, that a lot of doors will be closed in your face because people resent that. And what I found is the complete opposite, especially as I get older. When I meet young people who have something, I'm such a fan of theirs, and I'm so excited to help them and to just be like rooting them on, especially if I can help them through my mistakes, through my career, to be like, no, just do X, Y, and Z to kind of save them from errors I've had. Like, what message do you have to like young people who are graduating school? That I'm sure you've got something to say to them.
Yeah. So look, so on the Fountainhead real quick, that's an interesting observation. So the Fountainhead, right? Fountainhead was in the 1940s, right?
43,
and then 43, right? And then the 1950s, you remember even Joseph Schumpeter, who was the creator of the concept of, what do you call it? Creative destruction.
Yeah.
It's entrepreneurial capitalism. Like, he was the leading kind of chronicler of entrepreneurial capitalism. Even he wrote a book in the 1950s, and he basically said the door is closed. Like, he basically says it's all big companies from here on out. It's all these sort of managerial kind of, large scale centralized systems, mass media, mass manufacturing, mass government. You probably know, like, it was in that era that actually the number of countries in the world actually shrunk to the all-time minimum. The number of countries in the world got down to like 60 countries by like 1950. By the way, it's almost 200 today, right? And so we're kind of unwinding that. My friend biology kind of refers to that era as peak centralization, right? So that Fountainhead was written at this time, and actually Rand was interesting because she was fighting against this. One of the reasons she was interesting is the world really felt like it was everything. So power was all being consolidated, and ultimately, of course, the consolidation took the form of the sort of the Eastern, Western Bloc, Eastern Bloc, like sort of peak consolidation. And basically what happened is, in my field, starting in tech in the 1960s, 1970s, is almost like the return of an older version of entrepreneurial capitalism, and this idea that basically, no, you don't have to go to work for IBM or General Motors or the US federal government. If you're a kid and you have a new idea, you can actually do it yourself. You can actually build a product yourself. You can actually, pull a team together, raise money, and actually start a company. And I just go through that because it's interesting that like, that's the way capitalism always worked. And then it stopped working that way.
Yeah.
Right. For like this sort of aberrant period of time. And now it works that way again. Now, there are a lot of forces in the system that want to re-centralize and reconsolidate and bring everything back under control. But the fact is, we are in a system, at least in for what we do, in which kids can really do new things. The biggest piece of advice I give for kids for that kind of thing is basically get the training and get the skills. Like, don't underestimate the preparatory work that happens. Like, get the training and get the skills so that you're really good at it. And that's probably the missing thing. Like, I think that so much of the way this stuff gets portrayed is like, oh, it's these like happy-go-lucky kids, and they just have these great ideas, and they get their friends together, and wow, isn't it sort of what I said, the cute and fluffy phase of startups. It's like, wow, that was so much fun. It's so cute and sexy. They make the TV show. Seems like it was so much fun. Right? What you find when you're face to face with these things is the best people in the world, even when they're very young, they are generally very disciplined. They have really learned a lot. Like, they've really applied themselves to really learning and understanding the domain. Often they've worked for really good people, right? They've often worked for one of the really good existing companies. They've gotten trained up on how to run things and how to hire and how to manage, how to build things. And so my favorite piece of career advice of all time was, Steve Martin, in his book, Born Standing Up, he said, people always ask him, how do you succeed in comedy? And his answer is, be so good they can't ignore you. And that I think remains the core of it.
One of the things that when I first got somewhat successful as an author and I had some money in my pocket, I decided to go to North Korea because I'm like, okay, now that I can afford this, let me have this experience. Boys love their toys. When you started becoming successful, what were some of the cool things that you spend your money on?
Oh, well, really big screens, really big speakers. How's that?
That's it? No, like collectibles, no, like cool cars.
The bigger the screen, the bigger the speaker. So I don't know. Well, this is, I don't know. I've always loved what we do. It's really weird. Like I have a, I'm sitting here right now. My app's like, I have a monitor. It's like, fine. I have the camera. It's fine. It's the same one everybody else uses. I live on my, I live on my laptop, right? I basically live on my laptop. I carry it everywhere. I'm kind of online. I don't know. It's like, the most interesting things in the world are basically either the people you get to deal with, right? And maybe that's the answer to the question is you just get to meet, you maybe get to meet more and more interesting people. And then the other part is, look, it's getting really hard for any other form of entertainment to compete with the internet.
Yeah.
Like it really genuinely is. And so I probably get a, similar kind of amount of entertainment value as a lot of other people do. And then of course it's all actually relevant to me because it's all the companies we build are kind of at the center of this stuff, but no, it's probably that stuff more than anything.
Guys, I'm really happy to promote Fume, which is one of the best mechanisms out there to help you quit smoking and help you quit vaping. What is Fume? Fume is a natural inhaler designed for a better, safer way to quit cigarettes. There's no smoke, there's no vape. It's made out of wood, Canadian maple, and they use these cores infused with plant oils that are studied to help curb cravings. It helps you replace that hand-to-mouth motion that so many smokers are addicted to. That ritual is part of the addiction, and it makes it harder to quit cold turkey. Fume helps with the quitting process, and they have support beyond quitting with over a dozen cores for relaxation, for energy, and more. Think about how much money you're spending on cigarettes. Think about how much your clothes smell, what it does to your teeth, what it does to your health. Fume helps you with all that, and I'm very, very happy to be able to promote them. All you got to do is go to breathefume.com, breathefum.com/malice, and use code malice. You get 10% off. This is a great way to get your health back in order. They were from Canada, and they've helped over 50,000 customers around the world. You owe it to yourself and to your family to find a replacement for smoking that will make it easy to stick to not wasting money on that awful, awful tobacco. Quit naturally with Fume and use Malice to save 10% at breathefume.com/malice. And you'll be thanking me, I promise. Folks, your health is being bought and sold to the highest bidder. Lobbyists are fighting to make sure they don't have competition and you won't have options. That's where Crowd Health comes in. Crowd Health helps put your healthcare decisions back in your hands, saving you money and cutting out the middleman. It's not insurance. It's what insurance should be. And that's why it works. There's no deductibles. There's no networks. There's no copays. You see any doctor you want. You pay the first $500 and you submit any bills from there. The Crowd Health community takes care of the rest. It's a new way to pay for healthcare without premiums or deductibles or surprises. All you got to do is you pay one low monthly total to fund your account. It's less than $200 a month for most people. 100% of your contribution directly funds and reduces the healthcare cost of the community. You're not limited by doctor networks. They succeed by keeping its members happy. They help members shop for great care at a fair price. They make payments to doctors as quickly as possible. And they, Crowd Health, negotiates on the community's behalf when unexpected bills arise, which reverses those incentives that gets the healthcare system into this mess in the first place. Go to joincrowdhealth.com now. Experience freedom of health insurance. Right now, your first 6 months, just $99 a month, almost 50% off the normal price, and a lot less than a high deductible healthcare plan. Just go to joincrowdhealth.com/welcome. That's joincrowdhealth.com/welcome. Crowd Health is not health insurance. It's a totally different way of paying for healthcare. Terms and conditions may apply. Let's get back to the show. There's a book I read called Moonwalking with Einstein, where the guy teaches how to use memory and memory techniques to kind of compete in such things like that. And one thing he discusses is that in Japan, in farm work, they want to sex newborn chicks because they want to kill the males and just have the females so they can lay eggs. And basically they can't really teach this, but this is something through many iterations. You just learn how to look at as soon as it's hatched and figure out, toss them aside one or another. You must have at this point an amazing BS detector, in that when you meet someone, you could size them up extremely quickly, whether, okay, this person is a con man or this person is brighter on the level. Are there any kind of techniques you could teach other people that you can impart that kind of information? Because that's extremely useful knowledge.
Yeah, so it actually, this is actually a real answer to the question. So it's actually the way that homicide detectives question suspects.
Okay.
Which is basically, and this is actually useful. This is useful advice for two contexts. Number one, if you're evaluating a startup founder. Number two, if you've killed somebody. This is also very good advice, because you're going to get questioned, and they're going to try this on you. And so basically, it's you ask increasingly detailed questions, right? And so it's imagine you've seen this on TV 1,000 times, where they're questioning the suspect. It's like, well, where were you last night? Well, I was at the movies. Well, which movie did you see? I saw the new Top Gun. Oh, well, what happens at the end of the movie? Da 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 da. What did you eat at the theater? I had candy. Well, which kind of candy? And they go further and further down the rabbit hole. And basically what you find is basically people have a hard time BSing in detail. Like they can sort of BS at a high level. Once it gets into the very specific questions, like if they're BSing, they have to make up these sort of extremely esoteric answers, and they eventually run out of steam. And so the startup version of that, we call this the idea maze. Right. And
Okay.
so the startup version of that is what you're really looking for. Like if you're looking for substance, what you're really looking for is somebody who has already thought through in their own heads, like all of the permutations and combinations of all of the different things that they might try, and all the things that other companies have tried in the past, and all the different ways that people use these products, and all the different ways that we think how are we going to take this to market, and how are we going to price it, and what's the version 2 of the product going to be like, and so forth. And you basically just ask increasingly detailed questions. And basically what you find is the people who don't know what they're talking about basically fuzz out, right? Because if the questions get too detailed, it's hard to make up all the answers. The people who have been through the idea maze and have the level of substance that we're looking for, the answers, if anything, get better as you get more detailed, because they've thought about it and they have very crisp answers. And then ultimately what you're trying to spark is you're trying to kind of spark a certain level of sort of indignant anger, which is just like, okay, right? After 60 minutes of increasingly detailed questions, it's like, look, God damn it. Like, don't you trust that I actually understand? Like, why are you asking me all of these absurd, ridiculous, detailed questions?
You're a troll.
Yeah. Like I actually understand what I'm talking about. Like, haven't I proved that by now? Right. And it's usually at that point where we're like, yep, okay, this is the one.
It must also be really kind of exciting for you that you can discover so many great minds and kind of put them on the map and be like, that's really a kind of a great gift that you give to kind of the world. When you find someone who's talented and they've got a vision, and thanks to your resources, now they've kind of made the world a better place. I think that's amazing.
Yeah, that's really fun. And then, the other part of it, and my friends Tyler Cohen and Daniel Gross just wrote this book on talent that has a lot of this stuff. And Daniel's a top Silicon Valley guy, a good friend of mine. He talks about this stuff a lot in the book. And there's also a really big thing, which is there's the discovery part, but there's also the encouragement part.
Yeah.
And in particular, there's the encouragement to think bigger. Right. And look, every once in a while we run into a kid where they're just like so megalomaniacal that they've already got like some, gigantic big ambition in mind. But a lot of times you run into people, really sharp people, where it's like, okay, they have a very specific idea. It's a really good idea. But if they were willing to be bolder on their own behalf, they would probably, they would take it up another 3 orders of magnitude in terms of what it could be. That, have a much more expansive vision. It's rare, for whatever reason in our society, and probably in every human society, it's rare for people to get encouraged to not only do what they're doing, but like do something even bigger and more important. And that seems to be something that could really help.
Yeah, friends of mine made that same point. They said if you're talking to a VC, instead of asking them for like $250,000, it makes much more sense to ask them for 10 million, because if you're going to have them on the hook and you're going to be taking their time, they want to see, okay, I'm putting my money towards something that's going to have a massive impact, rather than something, even though it might be cheaper and still have that big impact, it still doesn't feel that way.
Yeah, the way we think about that basically is it's so hard to make a new company work that, like, if you're going to do it, you should do it big.
Yeah.
Right. I would almost go so far as to say it's just as hard to make a small company work as it is a big company work. Right. You're still going to pour 5 to 10 years of effort into building something. You're still going to have customers, products. You're going to have employees, management team. You're going to have to do all this work. So it's like, okay, well, why not, why not do the sort of full version of that with something that could really get big and scale? And again, yeah, that's the kind of thing. And look, the right kind of entrepreneurs, when they get kind of that feedback, they're like, oh, of course, that makes sense. there are people, by the way, there are plenty of people who would like to run sort of small businesses,
Sure.
who would like to run, kind of lifestyle businesses or whatever. And maybe, maybe in those cases they actually shouldn't raise venture, and they should deliberately do something that's sized differently. But for the kind of people we're working with, it's like, yeah, let's figure out how to get you to something that if it gets big, it could get really big.
I know Steve Wozniak was a big fan of either like IHOP or Bob's Big Boy, one of those. Do you have any kind of like guilty pleasures like that?
Well, there is the first restaurant I ever went to in California was the Peninsula Creamery, which is at a legendary place at the diner in downtown Palo Alto, which is still there. And so that would definitely be that's definitely outstanding milkshakes. So that's a good place. Yeah, there's a bunch of local hangouts like that.
Well, what about like, I mean, do you like shop at the Gap? Do you just like eat junk food? Like, I mean, when you have those kind of resources, are you always flying private?
It really depends. I'm trying to think of a good way to answer the question. I don't know. Like I said, most of what I do is working with other people. There's not a lot of, yeah, I mean, we you want to take somebody out to eat. Sometimes you want to take them out someplace cheap to make the point. A good friend of mine who was a big CEO, Scott McNeely, always very specific, built this huge company, Sun, very important company in the .com era. He deliberately took all of his new executive recruits out to McDonald's for their interviews because he was, making the cost control point. And they have delicious food. Sometimes, if you got customers, whatever, big investors, you might want to take them out someplace nice. But it's mostly just, the big question is always how to actually get into the real conversation. And so mostly what we're trying to do is kind of strip away as much artifice as we can and kind of get to the actual conversation.
How often do people tell you no on a day-to-day basis?
So it's actually, as a founder, so I was a 3-time founder before I became a VC. As a founder, you're getting told no all the time.
Yeah,
just constant no. And actually, this is the other thing I'd say is like the life of a startup founder has been enormously glamorized as compared to the actual reality of it. The actual reality of it is you're just get told no constantly. And by the way, this is true of like the best founders in the world, the best business builders in the world. They just got constantly told no, and they get told no, often not in like the polite way of like, oh, maybe later. They get told no in the way of like, that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard. I can't believe you're wasting my time. Get out of my get out of my office kind of stuff. And so, I guess, I don't know, I had like 15 years of that, getting told no like 1,000 times a day. The weird thing about our business today, about venture, is the shoe's kind of on the other foot a little bit, which is we say no way more often than we say yes, right? So we say no 99% of the time, probably. So I sometimes joke, like our day job is crushing entrepreneurs' hopes and dreams. Right, which is
what
like,
do you do at night? My God, you're a monster.
I know, exactly, right. It's like a horrible way to live. It's actually funny. It's actually easy. There are a lot of cynical VCs. There are a lot of VCs that are like really cynical and skeptical and sour, and the reason is just because like they sit around all day long and they tell people no, and then they fund companies and the companies don't work, and then they get mad, and then they don't fund companies that do work, and then they get really mad.
Yeah.
And so they kind of get into this sort of psychological spiral. And so one of the things, like for example, one of the things we decided as a firm to do right up front that actually differentiated us was we actually tell people no, like in a very specific way. Well, first of all, we tell people no. What a lot of VCs will do is basically if silence is no, right? And so like you just never get back. Right. And the theory of that always was, well, you always want option value. Like, because if you say no, you're closing a door.
Yep.
If you just don't respond, maybe later on you can say, well, actually, I've been thinking about it. I want in. But of course, this is a completely transparent maneuver, right? Everybody understands this. It's like a very mean thing to do to people, right? Especially if it's somebody who's like trying to make something work and they just literally can't get their, it's like, whatever happened to that investor? I don't know. They never called me back. So we actually tell people no. Another thing we do is we actually explain to people why we're saying no. Right. And so we'll actually go through and we sort of have this little kind of, script that we've evolved over the years, which is basically, look, we were founders ourselves. We always really appreciated feedback. We wanted to know what people said about us when we weren't in the room. And we wanted to know that so that we could improve. And so in that spirit, here are the, 2 or 3 or 4 things that the reasons why we're not at least saying yes yet. And, and we hope that helps you as you kind of, craft your story and your strategy for your future meetings. I would say about 9 out of 10 times people really appreciate that. And about 1 out of 10 times they really, really don't.
Yeah.
And I figure that the math on that works, but we do get people who are very angry at us, and we'll just, the other thing we try to do is we do try to fix our mistakes. Like these companies tend to raise multiple rounds of funding. And so you do try to go back later. Sometimes you screw up and you miss early and then you want to go in and invest later at a higher price. And so, you at least if you're doing this well, you're trying to build a relationship such that that person feels free to call you in the future or vice versa. So it's a tricky thing to do when you're telling people no all day, but you try to do it.
It's something similar in publishing. I know obviously many literary agents, and sometimes they'll turn out a book and that aspiring author would be like, I'm going to make this a bestseller and I'll show you. And that agent's like, I would love that. Like, I'm not sitting here like, I hope you fail. I hope you become homeless. And also if that, in this case, that startup couldn't get your interest at first, well, that just meant they're selling it poorly. And that once they have demonstrated they're doing something, you're more than happy to be like, oh, now I see what you're going for. And now I see that you got to do what it takes. I'm happy to join in. It's not some kind of contentiousness that I think when you're young and more thin-skinned, you're reading into the relationship.
Yeah, the other thing we get a fair amount. There's a criticism of venture that kind of goes like this, which is basically you guys are like these elitist gatekeepers, and you've got all these biases, and you're only looking for people like yourselves, and you're telling everybody no, and you're not giving people opportunities, and you're basically cutting off promising young people from being able to then go out and kind of build things. And my answer to that is always, related to what you said, my answer to that always is kind of like, look, we're the easy part, right? Like we literally are in business. We're sitting here every day. Our entire job is to fund startups. Like it's all we do. We're like sit here every day. We desperately hope every single meeting is the next Larry Page, Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates walking through the door with like whatever is like the breakthrough thing. Diane Green, like all these amazing people. Like we're very much hoping that that's what's going to happen. We're always sad when that's not the case. Like we're the easy mark. Once you raise money from us, then the hard work begins. Because then you have to go convince recruits to come work for your company. You have to go, convince the press to write about you. You have to go convince, customers to buy your product. Like you have to go convince other, harsher investors down the future to invest in later rounds or once you're public. And so it's like everybody after us is much harder to deal with, right? And so from that standpoint, basically the productive way to think about it is kind of use us as the test. Like if you can't get it past us, you probably don't have it, to your point, you don't have it refined to the point where you're going to be able to sell it to everybody else that you're going to need to sell it to down the road. And so sort of use us as the stress test and the gatekeeper. Now I will tell you like that's an easy thing for us to say. Yeah. It's a hard thing for people to hear, but I do think it's true.
Hello guys, Michael Malice here, underwear model to the stars. If you want to get inside my pants, you want to wear Sheath underwear. And the great thing about Sheath underwear, I just collabed with them to make and design my own pair. And they're inspired by dynamite, just like the cover of the Anarchist Handbook. If you go to sheathunderwear.com and use promo code Malice, Malice, you get 20% off. What's great about Sheath, and I wear them every day, is they've got this dual pouch technology because there's one pouch for one part of your male anatomy, another pouch for another part of your male anatomy. First time you try them on, you're getting all your hands in there. You're like, this is weird. And from then on, you're like, oh, this is the most comfortable underwear I will ever wear. It's got added comfort, added performance, added mobility. And there's something a little subversive about talking to someone while the whole time your underwear is cupping your junk. I'm not going to lie. I do enjoy that aspect of it. If you go to sheathunderwear.com and use promo code Malice, you get 20% off your underwear, including my underwear. That's sheathunderwear.com and use promo code Malice, Malice, for 20% off. You guys ever feel like you're being followed around the internet? Maybe advertisers know a bit too much about you. So our sponsor, Ipvanishvpn, is here to help you take back your privacy and help you become anonymous on the internet. Ipvanish is a virtual private network, a VPN for short, which is an important tool that helps you safely browse the internet. You can use a VPN on your computer, tablet, phone, whatever it is when you're streaming media. When you use a VPN, all your data is encrypted. What you're watching, what you're searching, what you're reading. I know what you guys are doing, whatever it is that you're doing. That's important because what you're doing on the internet is no one's business but your own. For a listener of the show, Ipvanish is offering 65% off their annual plan, only $375 a month, super easy to use. Turn on with one click. It runs in the background, helps to protect you while you're browsing the web. Go to ipvanish.com/malice and use promo code Malice. That's Malice to get your 65% off savings. Their annual plan is just $44.99 for the first year with our discount. This is the time to sign up because with our discount and their current promotion, you can get a VPN for 65% off the usual offering. Here's the thing. Ipvanish is the best of the best. 4.7 out of 5 on Trustpilot with over 6,000 reviews. Remember, it's ipvanish.com/malice to get the deal and start protecting yourself online. Let's get back to the show. Let's talk about something that's not discussed enough is when you get successful, there seems to be less of a guidebook as opposed to like how to become successful. You and your partner, Ben Horowitz, have been together for quite some time. When people become powerful, egos are going to happen as a consequence. That's inevitable. It's going to have to be like a marriage. What advice would you give people that once they become successful, how to maintain those working relationships with people that they've come up with?
Yeah, so we think a lot about partnership, and we use the term, very generally, but also very specifically. So for example, Ben, Ben and I are partners. We're 50-50 partners. We've been 50-50 partners now for years, in everything that we do. We've been together long enough now, where it's it's a little bit of a old married couple, kind of thing. But it's a very productive partnership. And I always talk about it as like a partnership is like a marriage. A partnership is like a marriage in the sense that you have to decide what's more important, being right or being a good partner, right? And especially, to your like high ambition, high ego, highly smart, highly capable people, for most of us, it's like really important to us that we be right. Like from an ego standpoint, it's like really important. It's really important that other people see that we're right. And that attitude is extremely poisonous, like in a partnership. And so I think one of the things you need, just like in a marriage, you need each person, and you need both people in the partnership to do it. Let's start with two, to start with. You need each person to basically be looking for opportunities to basically agree with the other person and to basically concede the point to the other person and to tell the other person that they're right. Right. And so and both people have to have that attitude, right? Because if only one person has that attitude, then it's a give and take thing and it kind of gets sad and depressing. But if both people have that attitude, then you're able to build on each other. And then you build up such a reservoir of goodwill, right? Where if you do have you do have certain issues where it's like, no, on this one, I really care. And I really want this one to go my way. If the other person is thinking, okay, on the previous 10, you deferred to me, you've now built up such goodwill on the emotional level that now I'm happy to defer to you. Like that's basically when these partnerships work incredibly well. Most successful tech startups are not solo founders, right? Most of them are actually partners working together. And so this dynamic ends up being very important. A lot of what we do actually is a little bit like couples therapy, with founders. Well, actually, this might be interesting. At least half the founding teams that we work with that have successful companies, at least half of them at some point have a founder split, founder divorce. Like it's actually quite rare when you have a case where multiple founders of a company actually get to the promised land and they're actually still together and they actually not only work together, but they like each other. And so, the human dynamics here are really, really important. And then look, you have to decide as you get more successful, your ego gets bigger. Like you have to decide like, okay, do I really want to continue to be in this kind of relationship where I have to give up all of this ego gratification in order to have the payoff from the partnership? And, I think it's like a marriage. Like at some point, I don't know what it is for a marriage, like year 5 or year 10 or something. At some point, you got to decide, like, even if you weren't sure in the beginning, am I all in or not? The way I want to live my life is I want to be all in on that, both in my marriage and in my business partnership. People make different decisions. I think in the long run, having the right kind of partnership can really make life a lot better.
Is there such a thing as fuck you money, and how much money does it take to have fuck you money?
So the problem with the idea of fuck you money, and you see this playing out in our society all over the place right now, is that there's a form of fuck you money, which is fuck you, I quit. And then I've got fuck you money, and I'm not responsible to anybody, and I can say whatever I want and like whatever. And there are some people who do that. The problem with fuck you money is a lot of our most productive people who end up making a lot of money in their careers, a lot of them basically, as they grow and advance in their careers, they take on more and more responsibility. And they have more and more people working for them, and they have more and more people counting on them. So I'll just give you an example of how I think about it. Our firm now we're over 300 people in the firm. I now have 300 people in the firm where if I say or do the wrong thing, it could really disrupt their lives, could really cause serious problems. And then we've got a few hundred portfolio companies we work with. And those founders, if I say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, they could all get hit. And then they in turn have all these employees. Right. And by the way, the customers, our companies all have these customers. The customers are making really big bets on the companies. And so when the companies don't work, it's actually a big deal for the customers and for their families. And so what ends up happening is if you're going to stay involved in the field, you end up basically taking on all this responsibility. You end up in these leadership positions. You have all these people depending on you. And so if anything, the reverse happens, like you actually get, it actually feels like you get penned in more and more. And so I would argue like, there's this weird perverse thing as a consequence that's happening, which is it's like the people in our society with the most responsibility have the least degrees of freedom. And then correspondingly, the people with the least responsibility have the most degrees of freedom. And like that, there's a tension there that I don't quite know what to do with.
Yeah, you make a very good point, because when Roseanne got into that controversy about her tweets about Valerie Jarrett, the reason they convinced her to leave the show that was called Roseanne that she created was, she's like, I didn't want those entire crew who depended on me, who I've known for years, to be out of work because of, my stupidity. So she, that's what convinced her to be like, you know what, I'm doing the right thing, but walk from the show. Like, I'll take the bullet, but there's no way I could take all these people with me. That's just too cruel. So I think that speaks to your point. You've met a lot of major, people throughout your career, obviously. Who is the most impressive person you've ever met?
So I would say it's, I'm going to give a cliched answer, but I'm going to describe why I think this is the case. So I think it's a combination of Andy. It's a combination of Andy Grove and Steve Jobs. I think Sandy Grove, the famous longtime CEO of Intel, who passed away, and then of course Steve from Apple. So I think it's Andy and Steve, and then there's a handful of people. I won't embarrass them by naming them, I don't think, but there are a handful of founders who are like this today, who I know, who I enjoy spending time with, a very small handful. And here's the thing that made those guys so impressive to me, and what makes people who are like this so impressive to me, which is those two had something very few people have, which is they did not take at face value anything that you ever said. So the way most people have conversations, a little bit like we're doing it right now, is you're like having it, you're like, the conversation is like a dynamic thing, and you're like saying, you're expressing it different kinds of opinions, and I like to talk, and I'll try ideas out kind of on the fly, and I'll kind of float an idea and kind of see what people think. You often end up making kind of these declarative statements around things where maybe you haven't like done all the research, you haven't
Sure.
fully like checked everything. And there's kind of a give and a take, and you kind of know the other person's got over their skis on something, but you don't want to embarrass them in the conversation. So you just kind of let it go. What both Andy and Steve had is they did not let you get away with that at any moment in any conversation. Like, not once, right? And so every single thing that you said, that you could see it in their eyes. They would be thinking, and it's sort of very flattering, because it's like they take everything you say seriously. Andy was like this. He would take everything you say seriously. He would take you more seriously than anybody else you've ever talked to. He would then think about what you just said, and then he would basically decide whether or not you actually like were merited, and basically where you were justified in basically making that statement. And then if he thought you weren't, he would question you on it, right? And it was like annoying in the sense of like you can't get anything past him, right? You can't bluff your way through any point in the conversation. You can't even just be friendly, right? and bluff your way through it. You have to, like, everything has to be validated. Like everything has to be fact checked and reference checked. So it's this sort of high tension way of operating. And with both of those guys, it was just like they were interested in the truth. Like they wanted to get to the substance. They wanted to get to reality. There was a famous Andy Grove story where he got mad one time in a meeting, and you may have to know Andy's backstory, but Andy was a Hungarian refugee he literally escaped Hungary when the tanks rolled in. He escaped. He wrote a book about this, but he escaped Hungary on foot. So he had been through hard times, and so there was this famous meeting in Intel where he got mad, and he finally slammed his fist on the table and said, "All I have in this world is time, and you're wasting my time." Right. So like every time I talk to Andy, I was like, it's going through my head the entire time. It's like all he has in this world is time, and I'm wasting his time. And so it's a high tension way of operating, but it is amazing to be with somebody who takes you that seriously. And I would say I've met 2 or 3 people since who can do that. And I don't know, maybe if I tell this story, maybe more people will think in these terms, but the world would probably be a better place if more people were like that.
Do you think that someone being somewhere in the autism spectrum confers on them an advantage, especially in the kind of work that you do? Because I've seen it a lot, where that kind of tendency to think more logically, that tendency not to be kind of confused so much by kind of emotional or things that other people can kind of get bluffed by, and that ability to kind of have that laser focus. That to me seems like a reason why people who are on the spectrum are so kind of overrepresented in startup culture.
Yeah, so this is where I'll tell you my current view on this. And I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not that confident in my views on this. But my current view is, there's this guy Simon Baron-Cohen,
yeah, of course,
who's like the world's like leading autism researcher, and so he wrote this great book called The Pattern Seekers a couple of years ago. And the way he describes it is he talks about the scale, like he spells it's the S and E scale. So it's what he calls systemizers and empathizers. And so he says, systemizers, which is basically it's the stereotypically male behavior, which is it's basically an obsession with systems. And and by the way, in like people who are actually full on autistic, that can be like, systems like, the, famous like obsessions with like the, the road system or train system or whatever.
Right.
But it's also just more generally, it's just obsession with systems. It might be financial systems. It might be how the stock market works. It might be technical systems, how software works. By the way, it might be business. It might be how do companies work. A lot of engineers are like this. They're systemized, mechanical engineers. They're just obsessed with the systems of how to build, mechanical devices. Electrical engineers are obsessed with like how to do like the power grid, like, things like that. So there's a systemizer side. And then basically what he says is autism is basically an overload of the systemizer, basically trait. And again, it's stereotypically male, which is to say, more men are systemizers, but there are many women who are as well. And then there's the empathizer side, right, which is the other side, which is basically a sort of corresponding obsession with people and with emotion and with relationships. And again, sort of stereotypically female, although a lot of men are also on that side of the spectrum. And then I think you could hypothesize that there's also sort of an extreme form of being an empathizer, which is sometimes there's a term sometimes you hear called ex-altruists, which basically are people who are kind of overloaded on empathy, right? To the point where it's basically it's just like too much. Like they'll just like left to their own devices, they'll smother people with empathy. And so I think that's basically that maps to what we see all the time. And to your point, like a lot of the best and brightest engineers and entrepreneurs we deal with are definitely on that systemizer side of the spectrum. That said, I take the other side of the spectrum, the empathizer side, as seriously. And the reason is because, and we see this every day, like our companies are not just an engineer or a couple of engineers or even 100 engineers. It's that plus it's going to be a lot of other people. It's going to be a lot of salespeople and marketing people and all kinds of other people who are going to be involved in designers and so forth. And then in what we do, like everything is a team effort. All these companies become large. They all end up with hundreds and then ultimately thousands and tens of thousands of people. And so even for the like highly, system oriented technical founder who came up in a computer lab somewhere and is not comfortable with people, like for them to run their companies, which is what we want them to be able to do, at some point, they have to be able to deal with people. Yeah. And they have to be able to deal with people at scale really, really well. And so we're trying to kind of get the systemizers to kind of think also, as empathizers. We're also trying to bring together partnerships. A lot of the best partnerships, a lot of the best founding teams actually bring together somebody from the systemizer side, somebody from the empathizer side. And then, frankly, also we're trying to get people on the empathizing side to really understand what's in the mind of the engineer, right? You also like you have to train the engineers like on how to deal with the sales reps, but you also have to train the sales reps on how to deal with the engineers. And then the magic happens when you can bring both sides of the spectrum together.
Folks, bodyguards, cases, and screens protect your phone so you don't have to worry. Your entire life's on your phone. Use it to plan your summer vacation, listen to podcasts, connect the world. That's why it's so important to keep them safe. I've dropped my phone. It has cracks on it. You need a case and screen protector protection. Bodyguards is proving that cases don't have to be big and bulky to be protective. They're designed by the bodyguards team in the US. They're built for both protection and style. They're engineered to protect your phone from 8, 10, 12-foot drops. Slim, pocket-friendly, tons of colors and styles to choose from. Remember, when a screen protector breaks, it's saving your phone. Bodyguards knows this, so they offer free replacements. You only pay shipping. When you buy from Bodyguards, a portion of your purchase supports a charity foundation called Relief Haven, which gives back to the local community as well as abroad to help children in Africa escape child labor. That's wonderful. Go to bodyguards.com/welcome to protect your phone today. That's bodyguards with a Z at the end, .com/welcome to start protecting your valuable phone today. Let's get back to the show. My protege, Trey Goff's a huge fan of yours, and he had a question for you, which was, you got into a bit of a public dust-up with America's sweetheart, Taylor Lorenz, not that long ago. What do you think is the state of tech journalism nowadays?
I'm probably going to mostly dodge the question.
Well, I'll put my turtleneck on. You don't get to dodge the question.
Yeah, give me the full Steve. Give me the full Steve treatment. Give me the laser eyes.
Yeah.
I don't know. Let's put it this way. I'm very pro freedom of speech, including, all kinds of speech I don't like. I'm glad we live in a society, to the extent that we live in a society in which people can say what they think. I'm glad that happens. The thing with a lot of stuff these days, I will say one thing, a lot of people are very upset with kind of how the national mood has changed. And, they get very angry about the role of the internet and social media and so forth. And people are saying lots of things they don't like. I do feel like, I'd be curious whether you think this, I know your white pill thesis, I'd be curious whether this falls into your white pill thesis. Like, at least the cards are on the table now.
Yeah.
Right? Like, at least everybody's declaring.
Yes.
right? And so if somebody really doesn't like somebody else, or doesn't like what they do, or doesn't like a field or profession or whatever, like there's not the era of diplomacy is over. It's all coming out, like it's all spilling out, and maybe it's just people can't help themselves, or maybe it's some sort of collective mood dysfunction or whatever, but like out it all comes. And so I guess I appreciate clarity.
How could clarity not be a white pill? Like if people even forget white pill, black pill, red pill, blue pill, I feel like Dr. Seuss, I still would much rather, if someone hates me, let's take out of the realm of journalism, if someone just absolutely hates me, like when I was in North Korea, they have a different perspective. It is much easier to reach some kind of peaceful conclusion if everyone's being honest. Like, okay, if one person's like, I want to kill you, and my goal is, well, I don't want you to kill me. Okay, let's see how we can work this out. So maybe you don't get what you want, I kind of get what I want, but at the same time, everyone peacefully reaches some kind of amicable resolution, as opposed to a lot of times when people are deceptive, from an evolutionary psychology point of view, they're going to be delusional as well, because the best way to be deceptive is to actually believe your own bullcrap. So then it becomes really hard, because you're never going to convince that person the truth, because they're too invested in their narrative.
I appreciate how elegantly you sort of conjoined North Korea and Taylor Lorenz in your says. I want you to know I picked that up. So look, you probably know the Timur Kuran's theory of preference falsification, right? So which is basically this theory of, he calls it private truths, public lies, which is basically this question he always has for any society, which is like, okay, what are all the things that people think and can't say? And then what are all the things that people don't think but have to say?
Yeah.
Right. And then there's always this question in any society of like, okay, what's the level of preference falsification? And if you get into like your point, like a true totalitarian regime like North Korea or the Soviet Union, you're going to, like, degree of preference falsification is going to be off the charts. Everybody basically, like that's the big, every time I read sort of accounts of like, people who like lived in the Soviet Union, the big thing that jumps out is just everybody was lying all the time.
Yes.
It was just like constant deception, self-deception. And then he talks a lot about this thing where it's like, okay, the problem with preference falsification is that not only are people being forced to lie, but also everybody gets a misestimation of what everybody else believes.
Yes.
Right. And so, it's like, well, I think this current regime is rotten, but everybody else seems to be okay with it. So apparently that's just how it's going to be, as compared to if I could read their minds and find out that they actually agreed that the whole thing is rotten, like then maybe the revolution would happen like a lot sooner, and we could get to better state. And so anyway, I think a lot about that. I would say there is certainly a lot of preference falsification in our current society. Like we're certainly not lacking it. And I think that's probably obvious to everybody right now. That said, like to your point, like I think it's good. I think it's good to get things on the table. I think it's good to find out what people actually think. I think it's good to get into the actual discussion. And so I guess I admire and appreciate people who are at least clear.
Yeah, that actually happened. Like, I think it was days after Stalin died, they started tearing down the gulags, because even the people at the very top, who were certainly sadists, bloodthirsty monsters, who had family members killed and executed, they were like, okay, literally not everyone in Soviet Georgia is trying to turn Soviet Georgia into Turkey. Like, this is nonsense, but we all have to kind of pretend because Stalin's convinced that it's the case. So it's also just, that speaks to the white pill thesis, how quickly, like once that main prime mover is removed, how everyone can look around as soon as one person's like, this is ridiculous, right? They're like, oh yeah, thank God, like thank God you said it, because I've been thinking this for years. And very quickly these kind of arbitrary synthetic systems, collapse of their own weight, because it's very hard to maintain a structure that is at variance with reality for an extended period of time. It takes a lot of costs in terms of either money or psychology or manpower or something like that. Speaking of that, I saw you recently recommended the book that I consider the most important book about politics ever written, which is James Burnham's book, The Machiavellians. What is it about that book that you found so cogent?
Yeah, so basically, like a lot of people, like I was completely shocked and stunned by what happened in 2015. Like I was just like completely politically, like I was just like I couldn't believe, that the Trump got nominated, and then in 2016 I couldn't believe that he got elected, and I was just like, okay, like whatever, and I read all the same, I read all the same coverage, I read all the same, I followed the New York Times, estimate tracker very carefully, and 92% chance of a Hillary victory at like 6 p.m. election night. And I kind of bought all the usual stuff, and then those two events kind of back to back, and then watching the reaction from that, even more than having a specific partisan reaction, I just realized like my conception of how the world works is just wrong. Like however things are happening, there's a cause and effect chain here that just does not map to anything I've ever been taught, anything I've ever read. something very strange is happening, and then it's basically like it's my fault that I don't understand it. Like clearly I haven't found the people who can actually like explain to me what's going on. And so the way I kind of think about how to learn about things like that is like, okay, now I need to go back in history, because I need to find out, like the big question is like, okay, is this genuinely a new thing, right? Or is this something that has happened before? And this is also really relevant to my day job, because of course, social media, the internet gets blamed. Basically, if anything happens in society people don't like right now, the internet inevitably gets blamed for it. And my question is always like, okay, is this actually a new thing that's happening today? Because if it's not a new thing, then it can't be the internet's fault, right? It's like, okay, is the internet leading to political polarization? It's like, well, was there political polarization before the internet? And the answer turns out to be yes. As a matter of fact, there was. In fact, it was quite intense, and in fact, it was in a lot of cases a lot more intense. And so, like, maybe the internet's actually decreasing political polarization.
Yeah, we had a civil war. People just gloss over that.
That was a pretty big deal at the time. Like, right, exactly, right. Or people talk about, oh, the internet leads to fascism, and it's like, well, did we have fascism before the internet? And it's like, well, yeah, we kind of did. And like, say what you will about Hitler, he didn't have the internet. He had to do it the old-fashioned way, and apparently it worked. And so, well, in fact, even political violence, right? A hot topic right now is the level of political violence. And it's like, well, was there political violence before the internet? And of course, the answer was yes. In fact, there was a lot more political violence before the internet. So anyway.
And let me interrupt, because I saw you recommend another book called Days of Rage, which speaks to the late 60s, early 70s, where there were bombs going off like on a weekly basis throughout America from violent revolutionary groups. So, but that's all swept under the rug, but that speaks to your point.
There were, as you know, there were thousands. There were years in the 1970s where there were thousands of domestic terror attacks.
Yeah.
And just memory hold. And by the way, this was not that long ago.
Yeah.
And I was a kid, and there are people who were active in those movements who were out bombing and who were in positions of like respect and authority in our society today. And so like that, this isn't even ancient history. Like this is a thing. And yeah, of course, that was 1972 or whatever. That was pre-social media. So 100%. So anyway, so I basically spent the last basically 2015 to like 2019 trying to not have like a lot of hard views on things, but just trying to figure out like, okay, let's go back and figure out how things got to this state. And anyway, long and winding road ultimately got me to the Machiavellians. And what was just so incredibly useful about that book is basically it describes a structure of power. It describes a structure of how political regimes operate that is not like, pro or con, left or right, as much as it's like, look, here are how these things are organized. Here's how power flows. And just for people who haven't read it, a big part of it is this sort of, it turns out, ancient theory of political organization, which is there's three fundamental forms of government: rule by the one, rule by the few, rule by the many. And then Machiavelli said there was a good and a bad version of each of those. And so rule of the one, there's, the good version is in his monarchy, the bad version tyranny. For rule of the few, good version aristocracy, bad version oligarchy. And for rule of the many, good version democracy, bad version anarchy. And so it's like, okay, and then it's like, okay, there's a framework for how these systems work. And then it's like, and then he goes through, and then he basically just demolishes the whole idea that democracy exists. He basically sort of rules that out. And he does that through, he talks about this thing called the Iron Law of Oligarchy, which is basically the masses can't rule because they're not organized. And so every political regime that claims to be a democracy, there's always some small number of highly organized people who actually run the show.
Yeah.
Right. And, in the US, we call that, it's why representative democracy. It's the, Congress is the formal kind of oligarchy that rules us. And then there's sort of the extended oligarchy of kind of the people who are in charge of everything. And then it's like, okay, now I get it. Now, it's basically, so the conclusion coming out of the book, I think most people have, is like, okay, America's not actually democracy, it's an oligarchy. Trump is not actually a Republican, he's a populist. It's a populist reaction to oligarchy. The populist reaction to oligarchy is something that happens over and over and over and over and over and over again, right? The problem with populism is that people can't rule because they're not organized. The problem with oligarchy is that oligarchy always goes rotten, right? It always collapses into self-interest and corruption, right? And so there's this permanent dynamic, and then these political systems kind of go back and forth all the time. In the old days, they actually used to cycle. They used to cycle all the way through all six forms. You start with a king, the king would go bad, the aristocrats would take out the king, the oligarchs would take out the aristocrats, and then there would be a democratic revolt against the oligarchs, and then it would collapse into anarchy, and then they'd appoint
Napoleon
a king.
comes in,
and then they go all the way back, right? Caesar at some point shows up. in our world, like we don't seem to ever get back to that original starting point. So we seem to vacillate between oligarchy and populism. And so anyway, like it's a conceptual understanding as opposed to just like a sort of standard partisan explanation. It does make things much clearer. Like it does make much more vivid and clear like how the current system actually works. And then I'm like, oh, well, this explains so much that we see in our day job, which is, I'll just tell you, like a very common thing we see in our day job is we will start a company, we will start a startup thinking that they're going to go compete with, existing companies in an industry. For example, the banks. We'll start a startup that's going to be a new kind of fintech, online bank thing, and they're going to go compete with the banks. They're going to compete with JP Morgan, Bank of America, Citibank. And then we'll basically discover the hard way that JP Morgan, Citibank, and Bank of America, they look like they're private companies. They're actually effectively adjuncts of the government. Right? They basically have the Treasury Department and the banking regulators wired to the point where the government basically won't even approve new charters for new banks anymore. Right. And then they have this, of course, revolving door, right, thing where they regulatory capture. They have this thing where basically they capture the regulators in part because they hire the regulators, right? When somebody will work for the government regulating banks, and then 2 years later, they'll be working for one of the banks. And you'll have this it's why you always see all these government officials that have like, Goldman Sachs in their resume, and then they go back to Goldman Sachs or whatever the big bank is.
Yeah.
When they're finished, it's like, okay, we're not up against companies, and we're not even up against the government. We're up against an oligarchic structure. Yeah. We're up against a managerial oligarchic structure. And it's literally exactly what Burnham describes. And it's just like, oh, okay, that is exactly what it is. And so now we know what it is. Maybe we can try to figure out how to deal with it.
Hey guys, Your Welcome is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Let's face it, sometimes multitasking can be overwhelming. Like when your favorite podcast is playing and the person next to you is talking and your car fan is blasting, all while you're trying to find the perfect parking spot. But then again, sometimes multitasking is easy, like quoting with Progressive Insurance. They do the hard work of compare rates so you can find a great rate that works for you, even if it's not with them. Give their nifty comparison tool a try. You might just find getting the rate and coverage you deserve is easy. All you need to do is visit Progressive's website to get a quote with all the coverages you want, like comprehensive and collision coverage or personal injury protection. Then you'll see Progressive's direct rate, and their tool will provide options from other companies all lined up and ready to compare. So it's simple to choose the rate and coverages you like. Press play on comparing auto rates, quote at progressive.com to join the over 27 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
Hey guys, I'm Sam.
And I'm Taylor.
We were just internet strangers who moved across the country to become roommates.
And now we host the F Word podcast.
Right here on Podcast One.
Our podcast is Fitness Uncensored.
Listen in every Friday for all things fitness, health, and lifestyle.
Think of it like FaceTiming your two best friends,
while also learning how to become your strongest, most confident self.
Join the community by tuning in and following us on Instagram
at F-Word_podcast.
Listen and follow the F Word podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever you get your podcasts. See you on Friday.
Let's get back to the show.
By the way, the closing thing I'd say is it turns out those forms of government are also the same way the companies themselves are run. So you actually have companies that are run like monarchies and tyrannies and aristocracies and oligarchies and democracies, right? And occasionally anarchy. Like, what is Twitter's form of government, right? And how does Twitter run internally as a company? It's like some blend of monarchy. They've got a CEO, but there's also a big anarchic component to it. And so it also turns out to be a framework of, because companies are political organizations like everything else. It's the people are involved. There's politics. And so he ends up describing unintentionally, he didn't intend this, but he ends up describing actually how companies work.
Yeah, I mean, he made that point, I think, in the Managerial Revolution, another book of his, basically the idea that governments and corporations, rather than being regarded as antitheses or different entities as time goes on, he was writing, I think that book came out in like early 50s or late 40s, but basically they're going to start to resemble each other more and more. And that much of what historically or, maybe philosophically would be the purview of governments, now corporate America is doing the governance. And we see that, I think, certainly is the case, like certain forms of behavior where if you have a day job, it's just complete anathema, even if it's on your social media. And that's a better mechanism and a cheaper mechanism for controlling a nation than it is through, kind of batons and edicts.
Well, then there's a very important subtlety, right? Exactly at that point. There's a very important subtlety, which is we have constitutional protections against what the government can do.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
We don't have constitutional protections against what companies can do.
Right.
Well, this is the freedom of speech, all the freedom of speech issues, the censorship issues. The government cannot censor us. The First Amendment enjoins Congress from passing laws that cause the government to censor us. But if the government conjoins with private companies and those private companies censor us, the First Amendment doesn't apply. Right? As every good anti-free speech liberal will tell you, the First Amendment does not apply to private companies. Right? And so this is the importance of Burnham, is to the extent that the ruling regime is conjoined government and business, the government can outsource activities to business that it itself would not be able to do. Right. And then as citizens, we basically have to decide, well, okay, like, is that an actual accurate reflection of like how the system should work? Is that what we all signed up for? Or actually, is there a sleight of hand going on here where there's now a government system above us that like none of us actually signed up for, that the founders certainly didn't anticipate, right? And that there literally is no law or regulation to be able to deal with. And like, is this a sustainable thing? The COVID regulations, all the COVID stuff, controversies, they all bore on this also. Right, like can the government require you to do X, Y, Z with respect to a public health crisis? Maybe not. Can companies require you to do those things? 100%, absolutely. Right, with no appeal, no process, no adjudication. Right, you can't. There's nothing. There's no basis to sue. There's nothing. And so, and again, it's just like, okay, strip away the preference falsification. At least let's deal with what we actually have here of how this actually works. It also, in my mind, it was the thing that really explained why so much of business has gotten politicized. It's not just that people just care more about politics, which is kind of the conventional explanation. It's that there are attempts to politically control companies for this specific purpose, because it's the escape hatch to be able to do things the government itself can't do. And then you start to wonder, okay, now there's something else happening here in terms of the level of political control that people are trying to be able to achieve.
You and I spend way too much time on Twitter, so I have to ask this question. Would you consider yourself to be based, and what do you think that term means to you?
I mean, it's sort of, what is it? It's sort of based and woke is the new axis. Yeah, I mean, I try to, we'll see if I can succeed at this. I try to stay out of partisan politics as much as I can for multiple reasons. Number one, I'm not sure anybody actually cares what I think in terms of partisan politics. The other is people really do get mad. So I'll try to sidestep that.
Well, I don't think it's partisan at all. I don't think anyone's going to claim, or I don't think you can realistically claim that, one party's based, the other party's woke. I mean, I think it's hard to make the claim that either party's based, but go ahead.
That may be true. Well, okay, depends what we mean by based. Okay, so what do we mean by based?
Well, what do you mean by based? So are you based, and what does based mean to you?
Well, so I would say the conventional, you can argue with me if you want on this. The conventional view is just flat out right wing, right? Like it's just become a shorthand for that. Okay.
I don't think that's true at all.
Okay, so the other, let me try one more and then see if you agree with this. And then is it confronting reality? Is that the?
I think I would regard it as being bold and outspoken in one's views, and being proudly defiant of conventional wisdom when it's absurd on its face.
Yeah, this goes back to the fuck you money topic.
Yeah, kind of. But I don't think you have to have fuck you money to be based. I think there's plenty of poor people who are nah, I'm not doing this, and that's pretty based.
No, but I think it's the other way around. It's actually
right. You're right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
I think it's actually the other way around. I don't know. Here's I guess I'd say in my day job all day long, what we're trying to do is we're trying to get to the truth. Like we're trying to get to the actual truth of like, okay, who's going to be really good at doing this? Is this actually working? Should we invest in it? Should we put more money in this thing? Like, is this going to succeed? Like, we're trying to get to, our customers going to want this thing. We're trying to get to the truth. I say, at least I aspire in the rest of my life to want to kind of have that general attitude. That said, as this is the world is, we said the good news is preference falsification maybe is falling, and people are putting cards on the table. The bad news is the world has become a bit of a political free fire zone.
Sure.
And so I will concede that I'm trying to stay out of the line of fire as much as I can, as much as my inherent personality will allow me.
Marc, we're running out of time. What has been your favorite part of this interview?
Well, so I'm dying to hear. Can I ask a question?
Yes, sir. Whatever you like.
Austin, what's your current take on Austin after your big move?
I am, first of all, as we speak right now, this morning, there's a billboard of me in Times Square. Tim Pool put it up. And I'm thinking of going back to New York for that only. I am so ecstatic to be here because as you were saying earlier, a lot of it's about relationships. So all my friends from New York, which mean the world to me, came here. I have a huge apartment which a house. I couldn't have had that in Brooklyn. I just bought a gun for the first time yesterday, literally yesterday. So the thing I was worried about in New York, I've got a lot of cool collectibles. Is someone going to break into my house? This is a real concern. That subway guy who shot up that station, that was literally half a block from my house. You could see the police tape out my old apartment window where I lived for 16 years. To go on that subway and have that constant state of tension when someone's blasting music or people getting confrontational, it's asymptotic because you don't know, okay, if this person is being this egregious with their behavior, where are they going to draw the line between and to see violence and see that around kids, that's something just very disturbing. The weather I don't miss. Austin has become I know you spend time here in Austin. Austin, I think thanks to Rogan, has very much become a Venn diagram of scenes. And when that happens, it always becomes greater than the sum of its parts, like New York, maybe in the late 70s, Paris, in the 1920s. You've got the crypto people here. You've got the biohackers here. You've got the comedy scene here. There's a big podcasting scene here. So many young and not so young, I'm gray, creators are coming here, putting up their shingle, and there's such a sense of collegiality, which I know in your industry as well, when you have that, you have competitors and rivals, but when you get together and you guys are each doing your own thing, that's such great emotional fuel. So I am so grateful for the opportunity to be here and to be, surrounded by so many people who I'm inspired by and admire and who care about me, and to be kind of a big fish in a small pond. So I can't say enough good things about it. When the biggest complaint is that sometimes it's hard to get a restaurant at 10 o'clock. I mean, that's kind of as close to utopia as you're going to get, right? If that's the level of my complaining.
And so would you say you feel more relaxed?
Mark, I didn't realize to what extent I had this low key tension the whole time I was in New York, especially the last 3 years. And once you leave it, it's like, oh, like that was it. It's kind of like I had stomach issues all my life until I took probiotics and fixed them. And when you have this kind of permanent condition, you just regard as the norm. And then when it goes away, you're like, oh, wait, that wasn't normal. I was just carrying this kind of monkey on my back for these years. I didn't have to do it. So yeah, it's just absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, it's exciting. I mean, we're seeing the same thing in tech. It's exciting because it feels like there was these small number of places where talented people kind of had to hyper congregate way past the point of rationality to participate, right? Maybe New York for media or finance, San Francisco for tech, LA for movies, whatever. And like this new world that we're in, like it's not that that's completely untrue, but it's not as true as it was. And it feels like there's like a great unwind happening. And then the positive effects of that in terms of people having a lot more choice, but also, the development of these new places. It feels like it has to be an incredibly positive thing that's happening, broadly.
One of the things I also hate, and I'm sure you feel the same way, if I can think of one thing I'm most opposed to, other than like totalitarianism, it's cynicism. Right. So when people take for granted what they have, so I'm so grateful to be in this position, and I feel so fortunate. And I would hope as many other people, have these great fortunes. Wait, I have to try this again because I need my closer. We're running out of time. What has been your favorite part of the interview?
Well, I'm always excited to talk. I'm glad you brought up. Excited to talk about Burnham. I've been thinking about that a lot these days. So I think that was very fun. Thank you for that.
You are welcome.
All this month, stream the funniest films for free on Pluto TV. Watch comedy classics like Anchorman, The Legend of Ron Burgundy, and Mean Girls. Or drop in for a Tyler Perry marathon with a Medea family funeral and Medea's witness protection. Pluto TV also has hundreds of channels and thousands of movies and TV shows like Get Shorty, Be Cool, Key and Peele, Comedy in Color, and more. And no contracts, no subscriptions, no fees, no joke. So download the Pluto TV app on your favorite streaming device and start laughing today. Pluto TV, drop in, watch free.